Welcome to Weird Web Radio, an explorer's guide to hidden worlds of the paranormal and occult, reality-expanding experiences, and the downright weird and bizarre. With your host, Lonnie Scott.
Hey gang, welcome to another episode of Weird Web Radio. I'm your host, Lonnie Scott. As always, I want to thank you deeply from the bottom of my heart and all of my soul, every bit apart, for you being here and listening. This guest is also a fellow podcaster, the host of New World Witchery, and if you haven't heard that show and you have a thing about folklore, witchcraft, any combination thereof, I cannot recommend that show enough. It's among my top 10 favorites. This, I assure you, is well worth your time to go check out. But Cory has an official bio, and I'm about to read it to you. Cory Thomas Hutcheson, Central Pennsylvania, in parentheses, is the co-host of the popular podcast New World Witchery, as I just told you. He has a doctorate in American Studies with specializations in folklore, religion, and ethnicity from Penn State. He's a contributor to the Oxford Handbook of American Folklore and Folklife Studies and American Myths, Legends, and Tall Tales. He's also written for popular occult publications, including Witches and Pagans. His book, New World Witchery, a Trove of American Folk Magic, is out from Llewellyn Publications, due April of this year, folks, 2021, I believe is the date it's going to ship. I've had the honor and the pleasure of reading it ahead of time, and I'm still going to make sure I have a copy on my shelf. It's fantastic and packed full of so much incredible information and research. Please go out there, order that book. If it's available now, go get it. If it's not in your favorite local bookseller, please ask them to go get some copies on their shelves. Let's see. In this episode, we cover quite a range of topics. Everything from, why witchcraft, what is it, what even is witchcraft, what's New World Witchery, what about divination, how did the death of his parents affect his spiritual growth, and so much more. I truly hope that you enjoy this episode. And as always, if you want to get a part of the extended interview and enjoy even weirder and stranger kind of questions that I like to ask my guests, you'll have to go to weirdwebradio.com, click join the membership, or go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio for $5 a month. Literally. The price of that macchiato, grande, cafe, latte, whatever you just had. You can have access to that and so much more in the archives. So do me a favor. Come join the membership. Help the show sustain itself and even grow as we go forward. And enjoy all the really awesome bonus material that's waiting for you. I don't want to stand between you and getting to know Cory better. So as always, please enjoy the show. Stay weird out there, my friends. Okay, we're recording. The brand new Zencastr countdown. It's working. Cory, welcome to Weird Web Radio. It is great to have you here, my friend.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. This is a lot of fun. I like the cut of your jib, as they would say. So
yeah, for everyone out there, I'm dealing with technical issues as we got started, and Cory's been epically patient as I've got them figured out. Hopefully everything in production goes great so you all can have a great show. It just even more testament to the character of the guest.
Well, thanks.
I appreciate it.
I mean, as somebody who's messed around with this stuff before, I know technology always fights you when you need it most. So you've done an epic job of battling that particular dragon, I think. So
I'll take that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess people don't listen to the show to hear about tech issues, though. Well, maybe. I'm sure one or two might be intrigued all of a sudden. So let's talk about witchcraft, since that is the bear that gets everyone's attention around here, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'll start at the very beginning with the word witch. You make a statement in your upcoming book. It's that the word witch is hard to define, yet it's one of those words that we all know what it means when we hear it. Why do you make a statement like that? Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think it comes down to the idea that we grow up with stories of witches, right? And witches are really is really a creature of narrative. The stories that we tell um, about about magic, about sorcery, and about scary stuff too, right? About monsters and things that lurk in the dark and things that are hiding in the woods waiting to get you, right? They all leave that impression on us from a very early age. And witches are something that we find some form of in almost all cultures. There's some version of this kind of folkloric creature that can work magic, oftentimes flies through the night, or appears in the windows at night. Seems to have an interesting sort of draw towards stealing children in some cases, or taking things from their neighbors, but also is sometimes a source of help to those same neighbors. So it's this thing that um, we all know, we've all encountered in stories. And so if somebody says witch, an image pops into your head, whether that's Margaret Hamilton in The Wizard of Oz, or whether that's a witch rowing a stone boat in a fairy tale, right? With Baba Yaga flying in her mortar and pestle over the sort of Slavic forests, right? Whatever it is, there's a version of that persona that's going to pop into your head. So we all know what a witch is for us, and we all know that everybody else seems to have a concept of what a witch is as well. But there's a lot of static between what we have in our heads and what other people seem to have in their heads sometimes. And so that gets to be obviously a point of contention for people, but it's also kind of a fun space to play in, because then you can kind of start looking for what do all these things share in common. And one of the things that I think they do share in common is magic, and magic really is this kind of driving force underlying the witch in witchcraft. So that's what fascinates me, I think.
Oh, I'm with you there. I mean, my entire pursuit into the realm of the occult since I was a very young teenager
Hmm.
has been magic. Like, what is actually possible? What is this thing? And um, I know for me, the first time I was convinced magic was real was probably the worst way to try it.
Hmm.
But I was retaliating against something that was hurting me physically,
Hmm.
and I in turn hurt them physically. I got started with a curse, and it convinced me without a shadow of a doubt that this stuff is real.
Hmm.
Um, I guess if magic is what pulled you into witchcraft, and what that common narrative that runs through everything that's always interested you, where was it that it convinced you that this is real? It's not just something in the stories.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because you got into it through a curse. I actually got into it kind of almost through wanting to be a werewolf. Um, so like when I was growing up, I was a really big fan of those old Universal horror films. The like Frankenstein and Dracula and the Wolfman and things like that. And the Wolfman was one I was a huge fan of. And I always had kind of a fascination with werewolves. And my school library, where I was growing up, had these like, they were basically books that were sort of like companions to the movies, that would talk about like the behind the scenes stuff and then bring in pieces of history and folklore that tied into the movies. And in the Wolfman one, they had this ritual for how to become a werewolf by like rubbing yourself with a wolfbane flying ointment and wrapping yourself in a wolf pelt. And I was like, well, holy hell, that's that's different. That's something new. That's not what I was expecting them to say. And so that kind of led me into kind of an exploration of that. And once I started kind of opening that up and finding this whole kind of magical realm of folklore, there was all this stuff that kind of kept falling out of the spaces between the lines and stories, or the little things that I realized were people were sharing all around me all the time. The see a pen and pick it up, right? Praying to Saint Anthony is something that kind of happens around my. I grew up in kind of a mostly Catholic household. And so like, you lose something, you pray to St. Anthony, right? So that kind of stuff's always kind of been floating around in the background for me. But then there were just some things where I would explore a magical spell. And I remember one of them was it was a magical spell where I think it was in one of the Cunningham books of all things. And it was you have a silver coin at the bottom of a bowl of water, and you reflect the moon on it and then wash your hands in that water, and that brings money your way. And I just did the spell. I was like, oh, this is just going to try it out. It's very kind of like you know, I was the kid who was like turning magic into a science experiment at times. And so I tried this out, rubbed my hands with this water. I was like, okay, well, it says something will happen the next, 28 days to bring this about, the next full moon cycle. And then lo and behold, to me, I wound up getting this like check for like, it was like $200 or something like that. That it was just kind of out of nowhere. Like it was like a gift from, I don't even remember if it was a relative or if it was just something that kind of like had been distributed to me somehow. I don't know how this happened, but I got the check for $200 and it's like, well, that worked a treat. I'm going to try more of that. That seems like, yes, please. I'll have more of that in my plate, please. And so it was, I fell in love with it. And even beyond just the spell itself, like I just fell in love with the sort of feeling of magic being around me and always kind of being available, even in these kind of little ways with the, finding lost things when they're by saying a little charm or something like that. Or, even, spitting 3 times on the ground behind you if you felt like something negative was coming at you or somebody was cursing you, right? Those little things were just kind of all around, and I loved it. So
Yeah, it comes out in the way you answered that question, and having the honor to read your book before everyone else, haha, nana nana boo boo. It's clear that you have this not only just a love for folklore, but you've clearly combed through folklore and found a lot of things in there that are unique, like those little tidbits. You've mentioned a few along in your answer. Have you got some that have just kind of become your go-to thing that you turn to again and again, a regular part of your practice?
oh sure, yeah. I mean, Saint Anthony is one of those saints that has kind of been around me for my whole life. So if I lose something, I actually lost. I have an Apple Pencil for my iPad, and I lost it the other day. I was literally just walking around the house muttering my little Tony, look around, help me find what can't be found. Tony, look around, just trying to find this Apple Pencil, and I did. So it worked out great. So thank you, Tony. So that's one I do as a go-to. Using red string tied in knots around my wrist, either as a protective amulet or sometimes even for headache relief is something I kind of go to. There are a lot of kind of written charms that I'll do where, it's sort of like writing an Inri cross or a Seder square for protection and putting that, in a door jamb or, under the sole of my shoe as a sort of protective element as well. So there's a lot of those kind of things that just sort of they're not huge. Magic for me is one of those things where like I really do appreciate ceremonial magic. It's marvelously involved and very, very intricate, and I love kind of the aesthetic of it. I love the sort of mechanics of it. I think it's really interesting, but I'm also I'm a Gemini, and so I tend to be very like scatterbrained and impatient. You may catch that from my sort of ricocheting off in different directions, even in our conversation. But I like to find stuff that's simple and easily accessible. That's very straightforward. That I can kind of see the connections. I can see how it works, and it seems connected to my immediate world, because a lot of the sort of ritualistic magic, and even magic that comes out of systems like Wicca, and I'm certainly not knocking Wicca. I think it's a beautiful system, and I've done some sort of outer court training in it, and it's a really marvelous practice for those who practice it. But kind of even within those systems, they feel removed for me because they're sort of based in a landscape that I'm not living in. So I tend to look for stuff that's actually in the immediate landscape that I'm in, whether that's rooted in the plant life that's around me or the animal life that's around me. Sometimes it's the stones that I can actually like literally go out and find, rather than going to a crystal shop and finding the shiniest amethyst point or something like that. Or just the charms and things that are part of the culture around me. So right now I'm living in kind of Pennsylvania German country, and I've been very lucky to make connections with people who practice the folk magic of the Pennsylvania German people, which is called things like Brauerei or Hexerei. Powwow is another thing it gets called sometimes. And from that, I've picked up a few little charms and things like that here and there. And I would never go so far as to say like, well, I'm a Browker now, or I'm a powwow now, because that would be very appropriative. But to say, oh, I can see how their charm works, and I can see how the mechanics of that work for them, and then sort of see how can I do that in my own way that makes sense to me as well, without stealing it from them, but sort of following it kind of within my own tradition, my own path. And so there's some things that I sort of learned from studying that group, and from talking to people involved with that form of magic. And then there's a lot of things that I've just sort of picked up from other places like that too. So there's psalms that I turn to specifically for particular needs. So if I need a little financial boost, Psalm 65 is where I go, right? So those kinds of things are a part of sort of my everyday, or my ongoing practice. I hope that to answer your question. I feel like I Gemini'd that one pretty badly in a lot of directions.
Hey man. You do you. That's what this show's all about. I don't like to talk about myself a whole lot on my show. I do insert little ideas here and there, though. I like one thing you point out there for sure. I mean, not that I have a problem with any of it. You're talking about the local environment, the more immediate environment being a big part of your witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
And I completely agree and respect what you're talking about there. I'm years ago, I'm certain it was Jason Miller that said it, but the phrase always stuck in my head: all sorcery is local sorcery.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I live in a small East Central Illinois town, and people can complain they're bored and nothing ever happens here. But the minute you begin to scrape at the dirt underneath your feet, metaphorically speaking, of course, you start to find interesting people and
Mm-hmm.
power spots, and places where you really feel put off, and other places where you feel overwhelmed with joy, and everything in between. And that's all getting to know your local landscape. And I think the more you do that in your own backyard, it better serves you even when you travel to connect to place when you go somewhere else as well. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, have you found that being one of those better bridges to build?
In terms of like just sort of looking, like you said, sort of looking at what's exactly around you and what's within your reach, basically.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you look at your own local places, what's someplace you've lived?
Mm-hmm.
What's one of your favorite pieces of local folklore that you've discovered?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's so much. There's so many things. I mean, I used to live in the South, and the South drips folklore. You can't walk down the street without running into somebody's story. And oftentimes that story has all kinds of dark twists and turns, things that would make Faulkner blush. They're just bizarre. Growing up around, the Haint blue porches, right? The porch ceilings that are painted with a very specific color of blue called Haint blue. Some people say it's to keep wasps from nesting there. Some people say it keeps spirits from coming in your house, right? So, and who's to say it's not doing both? So that's, a very specific kind of local thing. Where I am now, there's all kinds of interesting stories of, both spirits and, creatures. We have a local Bigfoot about 20 to 30 miles from where I live, known as the Albert Witch, who is he's a Bigfoot, but he's actually a little Bigfoot. Like he's a small. I don't want to call him a small foot, because I think I don't know about the size of his feet, but he's a diminutive sized Bigfoot, and his whole thing is he'll like sneak into your orchards and steal your apples, right? And like that's kind of what he's known for. And so that's such an interesting thing. And they even have a little festival for him down in this town that's kind of close to me. The town where I live specifically, we have a spring that runs through the town that has three places where it kind of comes up from the ground, and they all unite in this one park. And they've got this beautiful little space around where these three springs bubble up. I mean, it's really funny because the town that I'm living in actually happens to be named for a place in what used to be called Czechoslovakia, but the Czech Republic now. And it's named after this town over there where I actually had spent some time. And while living there in that area, I also came to learn a little bit about the sort of Slavic folklore of the goddess Libuše, who's supposedly the founder of Prague, right? And she had two sisters. And so when I go to the spring, one of them is a kind of bigger spring, and then there's two kind of smaller springs. And it, to me, very much sort of recollects that sense of sort of the three sisters, right? These three sisters that are over in the Czech Republic, but they're reflected here in this town that's named after a town in the Czech Republic, and that was founded by essentially people from kind of that area of the world coming in and settling this particular piece of land. So yeah, it's you're exactly right. You scratch just a little bit, you're going to find so much, and it's absolutely fascinating, and again, just riddled with magic, I think.
Yeah, that's cool. I like the story of the three sisters like that. One of the coolest thing I'm my own practice here in the county that I live in. There are three tributaries to the Mississippi River that flow through here, but three main rivers, and each one of those rivers is the main water source and supply to different communities, which I always found really interesting. So I've got a specific way of honoring all three of those rivers, throughout the year.
I love that. It's beautiful. And then the fact that those feed into the Mississippi, which is such a, sort of the main artery of this part of the world too. So that's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. If you get down into Southern Illinois, this poor, distraught, blasted out town, it's spelled just like Cairo, Egypt. They call that part of Illinois Little Egypt, but I think the people down there pronounce it Cairo, maybe. I'm not sure. Anyway, that's where the Ohio and the Mississippi come together, and you want to talk about, if you're someone who connects to the natural environment in magic and witchcraft, there's just about no other place in the entire United States that holds more really epic kind of flows of energy than that one. Not the one that I found, anyway.
Yeah, no, there's actually one of my folklore mentors. Well, he's not my personal mentor. He was the mentor for my actual like my dissertation advisor. But one of the people I kind of look up to, Richard Dorson, he wrote a book that's all about regional folk beliefs, and he talks very specifically. There's a whole chapter on what he calls Illinois Egyptians, because you're right, the folklore there is so rich, it's so dense.
Yeah. It is pretty interesting, and it could not be. Something had to happen in that area.
Yeah.
With those two major rivers coming together like that. It's pretty remarkable. Unfortunately, the communities around it are pretty terrible. So take a tent and find a wild spot. Your book, your show, everything, you have sort of branded the phrase New World Witchery to represent a lot of what you do. And New World being the key phrase in there, I think that separates it out from a lot of other things. So why make such a distinction by calling everything New World?
I've thought about that a lot in the past couple of years. Just kind of, in reevaluating a lot of things that have happened. And honestly, if I had to do it all over again, I probably would choose a different name, just because there's a lot of baggage that comes with the idea of calling something New World when you are then sort of recognizing, like, well, to whom was it a new world? Because there were people here already, right?
Yeah.
So that's a problem with the name. But on the flip side of that, there's also the fact that this is a land where we have a lot of different people coming together, right? There's a lot of different, it's sort of like the rivers, right? There's a lot of streams that come together here in a way that you don't get in some other places, where they're much more defined and they have a deeper, longer history, but they're also kind of more either ethnically or culturally isolated in certain ways too. And we talk about that, in kind of folklore studies, the idea that, like, when you tell a fairy tale, right, a lot of people will tell fairy tales that are kind of once upon a time, and there's castles and princesses, and it's very, you listen to it and you're like, that's very European. But we don't have that here. So the stories we tell are very different. They're bigger and wider, and they have a different flavor to them. We have a lot more legends, for example, in North America. And to me, that's really important, because North America has this incredibly rich set of traditions that are permeating the entire kind of just the whole continent. and they all have distinct flavors, but they're all also constantly kind of rubbing against each other. And there's some sharing that happens. There's some appropriation and some imperialism that happens too. There's issues with domination and issues with subjugation, but then there's also issues where you can see beautiful things flowering, like when you see a lot of native practices, particularly practices that you find kind of among the Cherokee and the Cree, that wind up getting incorporated into, for example, African American folk magic at one point, and those wind up flourishing within sort of contact with each other. And for me, like a lot of people, when they talk about magic, or at least when I was kind of starting off with New World Witchery, a lot of what I was seeing were people talking about like, oh, the folklore is important and the history and the mythology is important, but almost all of that seemed to point to these European sources. And to me, because like you're saying, it's got to be rooted in the place, I needed to find some of this this stuff that was already here around me and say, this is worth it. This is worth looking at too. This is all very valuable, and there's so much of it here. There's so many magical traditions in North America, and I've been absolutely blown away and heartened by the fact that people are really claiming that in the past decade, half decade or so. So many people are coming into a place where they can see just how rich the magical landscape is here, and are really, really glomming onto that and doing a lot with it, and oftentimes in very, very powerful ways. So I'm absolutely thrilled to see how many people are taking an interest in that.
Yeah, I dig it. I dig it. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
There's so much that's just right here, and often, I don't know. I think sometimes people are aware of how many different traditions are here. Maybe not so much the details, but in the last few years, the cries and concerns over cultural appropriation has become much more front and center in discussion than it has in many decades past. So you said something in that answer where you're saying that there's these things have bumped into each other, shared with each other, and then there's been appropriation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Sharing and appropriation often look like the same thing depending on the viewer. So how I'm not sure how to ask this, I guess. So where does the sharing stop and the appropriation begin according to you?
I mean, yeah, and then thank you for saying according to me, because want to be really clear. Anything I say about this represents just my perspective, and I want to be also clear. I am a white male, so I people like me have had their say on this topic for a long time, and I'm actually a lot more impressed by the people coming from, for example, African American backgrounds, who are reclaiming the African traditional religions, and also, very, very specifically talking about kind of hoodoo, for example, as a very, if not entirely closed, a very limited practice to people who are not part of the African American community. So, for example, there's a scholar, Katrina Hazard Donald, who's really gotten into it and said, look, this is Black spirituality, this is Black religion, and people coming in and marketing it and selling it, who are not part of those Black communities, are doing an incredible disservice to that practice and to the people. So I really do appreciate that that's happening. And you also have people, for example, the Bruja hashtag has really taken off, and you see a lot of people coming from Latinx backgrounds and from Afro-Cuban, Afro-Caribbean backgrounds who are grabbing onto that and really doing a lot with it, and I love it. So then the question is, where is the line, right? Where is the line for appropriation versus appreciation, versus exchange, right? And one, I think anybody can appreciate someone else's culture. I don't think that there's a line or a limit about you learning about someone else's culture. That you can learn about hoodoo, you can learn about curanderismo, you can learn about the Lakota Sioux, the Sundance traditions and things like that. You can learn about any of these things, insofar as you learn from the people who actually hold those practices and respect their willingness to share them. so the appreciation can happen anywhere, and anybody can do that. The exchange has to be mutually agreed upon. It has to be something where there is actually a relationship that exists between the people involved with this trade, so to speak. And it's not even always a trade. Sometimes it's literally just a flow of information that one party may wind up benefiting more than the other, but it was agreed upon. Both sides were very accepting and consenting to this kind of a relationship. And it really does have to come out of that relationship. It can be something where you're a tourist, where you suddenly feel like, oh, I like hoodoo a lot, and I want to go learn how to be a hoodoo practitioner. And so I'm going to go and keep my arm's length distance from African Americans and read about all this stuff, and never once actually engage with Southern culture or African American culture in any meaningful way, other than to sort of grab bag the techniques and grab bag the practices, right? And that's where the appropriation happens, right? Is people don't necessarily want to invest in their relationships. They don't want to become parts of these communities, or at least become actively involved with communicating with communities, minority communities, or whatever community holds these practices. And it's so important. People have to be able to have those relationships, and they need to make sure they're entering into those relationships without expecting that they're going to get this exchange, because the relationship has to be genuine. And then what you'll find is, if it's a genuine relationship, eventually that exchange probably happens anyway, because you sit around, you're having coffee, or you're spending time with somebody on their birthday, and you notice that they do something a little different than you do, and you say, oh, what are you doing there? And you get the explanation. And all of a sudden there's a conversation happening about that, and everybody's okay with that, as opposed to people who want to come in and just, again, sort of cherry pick and assemble practices that are not their own, just because they want to be able to claim the title, or even sell it. That's really kind of a bad thing. You can almost always tell there's appropriation happening when somebody who is not part of a culture is making money off of that culture. At that point, you have to go, okay, there's some appropriation happening there. So it really comes down to, is there a relationship? Is there consent? Is there a willingness to participate on all parts? And is the power dynamic such that all parties feel comfortable saying, okay, here's the boundary, and we're not going to go past that too? Because there are people who share because they're afraid, or wind up providing information because they're in a position of less power. And so you want to avoid that situation too. I know that's a really complicated answer, but it's a really complicated question. So
it's a very complicated sort of thing to tackle. But it's one of those things, if the opportunity arises in the right places and times, I think it's worth bringing it up, especially with somebody, obviously such as yourself, who's practicing in the most respectful way possible, while honoring the different traditions who've inspired you. I white guy or not, I don't think people are lining up at your door to accuse you of stealing from different cultures. I think your reputation is pretty solid on that front, so your voice does matter.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. Let's go a little lighter on the subject now.
Okay. have some softballs lobbed over the plate.
That's right. Yeah. So what's the one true thing about the universe? No.
42 is what I understand. So
that's right. Yeah. In your book, you talk, or you give the advice that people should create what you call a commonplace book.
Mm-hmm.
And I must confess, I wasn't familiar with the phrase commonplace. It sounded a bit like a journal, but it sounded like a little bit more and different as well. So for everyone listening, what is a commonplace book, and what might a witch want to keep in it?
Oh, this is great. And what this comes down to is, it's basically a grab bag book. I know I just spent like 5-10 minutes telling people, don't grab bag, don't when it's your own stuff, when it's your own traditions from your own family, from your own immediate culture that you're a part of, it's a little different. And all a commonplace book is it's kind of a way to assemble information that has been repeatedly valuable to you, or that you feel has lasting value in some way. So we have, for example, there are commonplace books from a lot of people kind of in the early colonial American experience, where they would basically be jotting down things like weather patterns, right? So they'll note the weather patterns that are going on around them, so that they then know how to plant, right? They know how to do the agricultural stuff they have to do. In conjunction with that, they also are taking notes on local births and deaths, right? They may write down a medicine recipe or two. They might include a recipe for a particular food that they make a lot, or molasses. Maybe there's a way that they like to make molasses. There's a book called The Long Lost Friend that was published by a fellow named John George Homan, which is very central to kind of Pennsylvania German practices. And one of the versions of that, I think he's got a recipe for like pumpkin molasses that's in there. And this book that has a reputation is sort of like a book of magic. But there's a molasses recipe and a treatment for like horses that have worms basically in there too. So what it is it's just finding the stuff that's useful and putting it together in one place, because what you'll see as you assemble this stuff together is that you start to get a real sense of your practice, not just as the magic, which is then separated out from your life, but as part of something you're living every day, that it is an everyday aspect of your life. The commonplace book puts that in context for you. So you include spells. Yeah, they're going to show up in there. Maybe there's a charm that you use repeatedly. I got my St. Anthony charm in my commonplace book. Also stuff that I've picked up and found useful over the years. I have for example, a piece of magical work that I picked up from a dream one time, and I jotted it down, wrote it in there, and found that it was actually fairly useful. And then I found it corroborated later in some other folklore, where I was like, oh, this is that same thing that came up in a dream at this one point. And so it was really, really interesting to sort of have that surface in this scenario. But it was it's in my commonplace book, and it's been there for a while. And so, in addition to that, I've got some recipes from, my mom's gingerbread cookies that get crammed in there too, right? Because that was a big part of my holiday celebrations growing up. I regularly have tried to keep track of things like moon phases, and those go into a slightly different book, but they're, I can pull out of that. I can take notes and put those in my commonplace book too. So it's almost like, to put it in a kind of contemporary context, I know a lot of people get into this whole concept of like bullet journaling right now, where there's, sort of listing out everything on their to-do list and making notes about their projects and plans and ambitions. So imagine if you took a bullet journal, a family scrapbook, and your grandmother's old falling apart recipe book from the back of the kitchen cupboards, put those together, and then added some spells in there. And that is kind of what a commonplace book is. It is the everything but the kitchen sink book that really sums up what it's like to live in your kind of folk world. And that helps shape that magical practice for you. Does that answer the question?
No, not at all. No.
Okay. Okay, back to the beginning. Okay.
All right. Something else really cool about that you pointed out in the book, and spoilers, folks, spoilers. There's a lot in this book, so don't worry. We're not giving a lot away here.
Yeah. If you need a doorstop, this is the book to get for sure. So.
You mentioned how you're also leaving something for descendants to find, people of future generations. I think that's a really cool way to look at this, because I don't know, the way you describe putting together this book feels way less formulaic and homework kind of vibes to it than your typical magical journal or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I liked it a lot.
Well, thanks. Yeah. I mean, I can't take credit for this. This is something that obviously has been done for hundreds of years. And I'm just kind of pulling it into my book and giving it some connection to magical practice, even though that already exists. I'm just trying to help people see that that's a thing they can do. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people get really hung up on, they want to have the book of spells from Practical Magic, right? That flips open in 3 different directions. And or they want the grimoire that, you know, looks like it's been bound in human flesh since ancient days or something like that. But a commonplace book is there's no you don't need to be formal with it, right? It is literally there to hold your ideas together. And if you ever want to take that and make it pretty, or do something with it to you know, maybe make a book of spells that's very pretty, you can still do that. But the commonplace book just holds all these pieces together, again, kind of like a scrapbook. And it is something that you can pass down to descendants. So I have, you know, my mom's old recipe. I call it a book, but it's a binder, right? It's a little binder full of her stuff, and I'll find like handwritten notes from her, and other little bits and pieces from growing up, that aren't just the recipes, that tell me something about my family history. So, like, I learned that we had our family had a relationship with the royal bakers of Denmark at one point, through this this book that wound up in my possession.
Nice.
And the commonplace book should do that. It should give these little hints and trails and fragments of your life and the life of others that have been important to you, and share those with other people who are going to find them afterwards, and then maybe take some of your commonplace book and add it to their commonplace book. So it's a living kind of text in that way, and I love that.
I like that too. And people out there will know exactly what I'm talking about if they nerd out on certain things that I do. But one of the things that made me think of immediately was the TV show Supernatural. You watch it?
I've seen like the first season or so.
Yeah, the book that the brothers are always referencing that their dad had from all these years of hunting, you know, the monsters and the creatures and whatnot, and all these practical tips. And they're always like, well, Dad had an answer in that. Dad had an answer in that. And that's kind of what it makes me think of.
Yeah.
One of the things you talk about as well when you're in the book talking about putting together a commonplace book, I just said book like 3 times in 10
It's
words.
all right.
Fuck yeah.
It's late, I know.
Is including family stories. And I couldn't agree more. Researching my own ancestry, my favorite things that I find are always the personal details. And I think doing that, I've not only learned, you know, about these people who are just names and dates before, a little bit more about who they are, but it's just interesting to notice certain patterns and consistencies that pass through the generations that lead to me. And I think it helps me understand more of who I am sometimes too. When you go out collecting stories about family and things like that, you already mentioned this, you found these handwritten notes. What's something that you discovered aside from that you would consider your kind of your favorite, or one of your favorites?
Oh man. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I have a family story that I grew up with about my mom and her siblings. They grew up in the area, the era of the Mickey Mouse Club. But they also happened to live near a few of the Mouseketeers. And apparently my mom and her siblings, there were 7 of them in the family, were kind of bullies. So they would like bully these poor Mouseketeers.
Oh no.
I know, it's terrible. But then, so there's that story. There's a lot of stories of my mom, of some of my aunts and uncles doing, like, there's a story about Aunt Lulu and this goose that was not very nice to her. And then finally one, I think it was Christmas, when Christmas, they had to take the goose and they were going to, you know, have a Christmas goose. And Aunt Lulu volunteered to sit on the goose in the back of the truck as they took it to get butchered. And they talk about how big her smile was as she was sitting on this goose in a bag, because it had attacked her so many times. I apparently have a very vindictive bloodline somewhere in there.
I'm starting to notice that pattern I was talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, one thing that I think I get into it in the book, but one thing I do also think is important is, like, we're talking about family, and yeah, your kind of ancestral family is really important, but there's also this element of like chosen family, where there are people, you know, a lot of people, especially in the South, I know, where you have aunts and uncles who are not actually blood relations to you in any way, or even married relations to you, but you call them aunt whatever or uncle whatever. My own kids have a few of those, right? And their stuff should be filtering into your life, into your commonplace book, into what you see, and you should be willing to learn from them and consider them family. I mean, I have stories about a friend of mine who, basically his family took me in after my parents died in a lot of ways. And I have stories about his family, and he has a wonderfully, marvelously crazy grandmother. And I have her stories in my head and in my sort of, quote unquote collection as well. So, I want to make sure people understand, like, family can be much bigger than just sort of like trying to trace your genetic roots. It should be this kind of, it's not just a vine twining backwards through time. It is an enormous tree branching off in 1,000 different directions. And that's kind of the wonder of it. It's kind of the marvel of it. And I encourage people to go and try to figure that out.
Now, you said that someone took you in after your parents died. Did you lose your parents at the same time? Like both of them at the same time?
Not quite. So I lost my mom when I was just about 16 to a type of cancer, and then actually she died in February of that year, and it happened to be that the Christmas right before she died, my dad, my mom and dad were divorced, but I still saw a lot of both of them, obviously. But my dad got diagnosed with a cancer that couple months before my mom actually died of cancer. So it was going from one parent having that sort of roller coaster to this second parent then going on that roller coaster. And then he died when I was 19 or 20. So that was, I lost them both fairly young. And so that, definitely had some effect on me. I think maybe a lot of why I'm sort of like, look for family everywhere. Like, it's very obvious psychological maneuver.
That could have been. Yeah. I guess confronting such a death in such intimate relationships like that, such, so near and dear at a young age. Were you already getting into your witchcraft by this point? And if you were, or even any kind of spirituality, when you look back, do you think losing them that young had some sort of lasting impact on your practice?
Oh, I mean, I think it definitely made me feel like it made me want to confront death in some very specific ways, because, I was actually in the room when my mom died, and that was a very powerful experience. But it was a very real sense of like, okay, so I know what this looks like now, and it's something I don't want to spend the rest of my life being afraid of. But at the same time, I'm also, if you have two parents that die in their 50s of cancer, there's a feeling of like, well, I guess I have an expiration date on myself too. So I have used that as a sort of like, well, if that's true, then I want to make sure I can accomplish as much as I can by that point. And then every minute I get is sort of gravy, right? It's sort of the extra frosting on the cake. And that's wonderful. And I think that it's been a very good thing in some ways. And then in terms of like getting into my witchcraft, it's funny. I actually made my mom buy my first quote unquote witchcraft book, which was this big thing called the Encyclopedia of White Magic by a woman named Patty Slade, who was a British witch, but what she was practicing was slightly different than a lot of other Wicca that was around there. So they had different holidays, like they celebrated Michaelmas, which is not something I've seen celebrated in a lot of Wiccan rituals. And so there was a lot of like very folksy folk magic type stuff embedded in this. And she bought it from this bookstore and was very, very reticent to pick it up for me. But I was, I kept saying, no, look, it's quote unquote white magic, right? It's good magic, which I think now we would veer away from, calling things white and black magic. I think that's a way we hopefully are learning better as a culture in some ways. But then my dad, like, I'd fully gotten into kind of, magical religion at that point. And my poor dad, he's sitting there, dealing with cancer and trying to get over that. And at some point in there, I left him a note because I wanted to talk to him. I never got the chance to actually talk to my mom about my magical practice and beliefs, even though so many of them would have been intertwined with some of the things that I learned through her. But then with my dad, I was like, well, I'm not going to miss this chance. I want to have this conversation. And so I left him a note saying, Dad, we really need to talk. And I came in that night And he said, okay, well, okay, let's talk. And I said, okay, I, I, I'm a pagan. I'm a neo-pagan. I'm a witch, however I phrased it. I don't think I said I was a Wiccan, but something in that vein. And I just saw this wave of relief go over him. And he's like, oh, I thought you were going to tell me you were on drugs. Just this total relief from it. So that went fairly well. I gave him a copy of, I think it was Cunningham's Truth About Witchcraft Today at that point. And he led the church choir, and he was religious to a point, but it never soured our relationship or anything like that. So that worked out okay. But it was definitely an interesting set of events there for me.
I'd say so. And then you gave the poor man a copy of Truth About Witchcraft Today.
Yep.
I remember that book. I'm 43 years old, and back in the 90s, that book, if I remember right, had like a picture of a woman in like a business suit.
Yes.
Yeah, on the cover.
Yeah, it looked like an ad for car insurance or something.
It did. Llewellyn has gotten so much better in everything they do. It's almost a shame that people only remember the bad things in the 90s, because they've become quite a powerhouse of a publisher again, I think.
Sure. Yeah. They have some really good stuff coming out, I think. So
that's a fact. I signed a contract with them, so
they have been making a lot of moves, and I think right now they're really trying to embrace folk magic, because they're seeing the sort of value that it has in people's lives, which is good.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm going to have to leave some stuff on the floor here just out of interest of time, but I'm not going to.
I'm sorry. I know I'm really long-winded.
No, that's perfect. That's why we're here. That's why we do this, right? I want to talk to you about divination specifically because, well, one, divination is like absolutely near and dear to my heart. Tarot, I often say, is my occult drug of choice. I work with runes intimately, not so much as divination purposes, but I do. But runes are a huge part of what I do as well. I got interested in using playing cards for forms of divination, in part because of you.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's your fault. But you say something in your book I thought was really cool, that deserves some more conversation. The direct quote right out of your book is, "What they may be missing is just how central to so many pieces of American history and culture divination had been. So whoever they be, what are they missing?"
Oh, sure. I mean, you can't throw a rock in a history book without hitting a moment in time. At least since, well, no, I would say really in all of North American history. But thinking here of sort of U.S. history, there have always been these moments of divinatory practice or prophetic revelation going on, just throughout. So during kind of the Revolutionary War era, they just come through something called the Great Awakening, and you had a lot of people who were sort of prophesying, right? And there's this one amazing prophet who she was born Jemima Wilkinson, but she I say they really, because once this whole process happened, they were essentially agendered at that point. They were non-binary. And so they became, they went through this like sort of near-death experience, and then they sort of resurrected out of that, and they became known as the Public Universal Friend, or PUF, often called the Puff, which I love. And they would they would reveal these kind of like spiritual messages, which were really cutting edge at the time, like very like progressive. Sort of like, what Abigail Adams is saying, like, hey, remember the women when you're working on the Constitution. That's very in line with stuff that the Puff was kind of going on about. But they could also, what was really fascinating was they could go and preach to British soldiers in a British camp, and then preach to the colonial rebels in their camp. And they were one of the very few people who could kind of cross those lines because they had what was seen as sort of this gift of prophecy, right? And then, you flash forward another, couple of dozen years. I mean, the founding of Mormonism is very based in divination, the revelation through these sort of golden plates, seen through a peep stone, which is a very kind of magical thing. You get into the late 1800s, you have spiritualism and medium communication is a huge deal. Moving into the 20th century, you have the Holy Rollers and the sort of Pentecostal movement, speaking in tongues and revelation that way. By the end of the 20th century, you literally have Ronald Reagan in the White House with an astrologer on call, basically. So divination, this sort of dependence on sort of the mystical side of knowledge and the mystical side of life, is absolutely a piece of the history here. And it surprises, well, it doesn't surprise me, I guess, because it certainly can get weird and wacky, and I think that's great for your show, because your show is all about the weird, and I love it.
That's right.
But because it can be kind of weird and wacky, I think people, sort of, they don't want to look directly at it in the history books, but it's so crucial. You think about, for example, I mentioned spiritualism and mediumship, right? That's huge. It's a huge deal because it's happening right at the end of the Civil War, when thousands upon thousands of people have left their homes and will never return again. And of course, what are people going to do? They're going to try and contact them in the spirit world. And the people who are left behind are largely women. So this is one of the first major spiritual movements that is being led by women. And it is absolutely tied to suffragism, right? Which is also tied to abolition. So it's this piece of American history that, I mean, absolutely ties to so many other big pieces of the history that we know, but we don't acknowledge it sometimes because it's the weird stuff, right? It's the, oh, they're listening, they're tilting tables, or they're somebody's speaking in someone else's voice through that person, right? But it meant something. It was really important to the people who were doing it. It gave them closure after this enormous war. It gave them spiritual and sometimes even political power when they were coming from a place of disenfranchisement. It's a very powerful thing. And divination is all about knowledge. It's all about being able to share your vision of a different world, or of a world in which you know something that maybe not everyone else knows, and work towards something. I think that's one of those sort of marvels of divination. And yeah, and it absolutely has this big place in American history. So I hope people will dig into that. There's some really great books on this, really great resources. You should absolutely go check out more information on all of the sort of divination oriented history in American, the American sort of story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one excellent book out there I highly recommend, and a friend and former guest of the show as well, author, is Occult America by
Mitch, yeah.
Mitch Horowitz.
Yes.
Mitch is a fantastic human being. You want to talk about a guy who has dug out the dirty secrets.
Oh, he's so good. He's so good at that.
He's so good at what he did. One more standard question for the show.
Sure.
This one's non-negotiable, or at least around these parts. Cory, have you ever experienced a haunting?
Oh, gosh, I love that question. Yes, yeah.
Tell.
So I've got two different stories that I think I can go with here. One, a friend of mine and I were having a sleepover, and this was out when I lived on a farm kind of in rural central Tennessee at the time. And we're just mentioning the Civil War. It happened to be very close to a Confederate cemetery. It also happened to be very, very close to a skirmish zone for one of the kind of major battles in that area. The battle field was literally, a 20-minute drive down the road from where we lived. So I would find Civil War bullets in our creek sometimes, or embedded in the trees on our land. So like very, very present there. Well, one night this friend was having a sleepover, and we had, I don't know if you've experienced this phenomenon about a lightning storm where there's no real rain. It's just lightning all the time.
Yep.
And so we were, in the house, there's a lightning storm going on. And we noticed kind of at the back window down by this creek that we could see kind of from the top of the hill that we were on. We noticed what looked like people kind of walking in the woods. And at first we're like, oh man, there's hunters or something like that. They got caught out there in the middle of the storm. That's terrible. But as we looked more and more, we realized that the clothing they were wearing was very out of place. And it wasn't like they were all in like blue or gray uniforms, but very kind of homespun type of material. The hats were not hats that, we normally, see people wearing now. They weren't like, ball caps or anything like that. And it, and I've done enough studies on the Civil War kind of post that to be like, oh, these were kind of, these were soldiers who didn't have regular uniforms, or maybe only had partial regular uniforms, but were, part of this detachment. And so we saw them kind of moving through the forest, and the lightning, of course, was sort of flashing, and then we'd lose them for a little bit, and then flash again, and we'd see them. And at some point, we realized they were kind of starting to turn and come up the hill. And at that point, my friend and I, we lost it. Like we ran into a bedroom and closed the door. And so that was kind of a moment. And they didn't it wasn't like they came in the house or anything like that. That was it. And then one other experience that I had, and this is a totally other end of the spectrum. I had just set up this sort of ancestor space, this little family, I don't even call it an altar, but just sort of a little family memorial space kind of near our front door in our house where we were living at the time. And I was married at this point. And I'd set this up, and I'd happened to kind of, say some prayers and some, memorial things just kind of for my family, and particularly for my mom, who I was kind of missing at that point. And then I went to bed that night, and I had this moment where that hypnagogic state where you're kind of half awake, half asleep. And I noticed that the door to the bedroom looked like it was open, which it normally is not. And it felt like there was this shape kind of coming down the hall through the door. And if you went around the corner in the hall, you'd go to the front door where the little altar space was. And I could really feel like it wasn't like a shadow. It was just kind of like almost like a ripple, kind of moving down the hall into the room. And that came up next to the bed. And I didn't see any defining shapes or features or anything like that. But then I felt something reach down and just brush the hair off my forehead. And the second I felt that touch, I knew it was my mom. And it was just this moment where it was so deeply comforting and so deeply beautiful. And I just, I felt instantly at peace and instantly relaxed and very, very just happy. And went back to sleep at that point. But I had been visited, and it was just the one of the most powerful moments for me. So yeah, two very different kind of haunting experiences there.
Yeah, that's lovely. I thank you very much for sharing that.
Of course.
Excellent. I guess we've come near to the end of the hour. That worked out real well. Is there something that I should have asked, or something you'd like to talk about that I didn't cover? I know we didn't bring up your book yet. You do have your new book coming out.
We mentioned it a few times. I think we're good.
Yeah. So if you have any parting thoughts, go for it and tell people where to find you, your book, and everything you do.
Well, sure. Yeah. Well, so the book itself will be coming out in April. It's called New World Witchery. So easy enough to find. If you know me from the podcast, you'll be able to find the book pretty easily. And it's like 450 to 500 pages. I can't remember the final page count. It's very big. Lots of information in there. I think there's over 500 pieces of folklore is what I tallied up, because I'm a nerd and I kept a spreadsheet. So it's a lot of stuff in there. If you're interested, check it out. It'll be available from Llewellyn Books in April, and you can order it on bookshop.org or wherever you get your books. It'll be available there. And then I'm also working on a project for Llewellyn with their we're putting together kind of an anthology of North American folk magic from practitioners' points of view, which is supposed to be coming out in, I think, 2022. And it's wonderful because we're actually getting people from all of these disparate practices, and they're all sort of providing their own case studies or perspectives on their practices. And we're going to kind of pull that together, and I'll be editing it and providing some sort of introductions and commentaries on all these. It'd be really wonderful though, because you'll really get to see and hear those practices from the inside, from practitioners of those practices, talking about like what are the things that you need to know, what are the spells that they're working, what are the things that are sort of central to the belief system. Is it an open or a closed practice that comes up, things like that. So that'll be out in 2022, and I hope people will check that out too. And then beyond that, if you are interested in knowing more about North American folk magic, there's a podcast you should probably check out called New World Witchery, because there's like 10 years worth of talking about that topic just floating around out there for you. So
I'm super stoked to recommend the book and the show. I've been a fan of your show for a long time.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk about this once in a while, I think, to bring it up when I have other podcasters on the show. I don't remember exactly where I heard the phrase mutual flourishing, but I took it deep into my like life as a pursuit, that all of us who are content creators in this particular realm of thinking, like anything we can do to just boost the signal for someone else, I think is fantastic. So having other people on the show like yourself who have a show, who are creating content, that's the reason you do these things, right? Is to give someone else a voice to another audience that may not have found you otherwise.
Yeah, I love that. I love that approach.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'll take that.
Yeah, no, that's really, I love that. I think that's a really beautiful way of looking at that.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to answer some questions and let us all get to know you better. For everyone out there who's listening, if you know the drill by now, and if you're new here, if you want to hear the rest of this conversation, you're going to need to go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio or go to weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership. Click the bonus audio level for the membership, and you'll gain access to not only the further discussion that gets pretty weird with Cory, but you'll get access to the entire archives as well. Thank you all for listening. Yeah. Thank you all for listening. Please go check out everything that Cory has to offer, and stay weird out there, my friends.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Now it's bonus audio time. The really weird shit. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. First question around here is always the same. What famous person's resting place do you most want to visit? Do you want to hear how they just answered that question? What famous person's resting place would you most like to visit? That and many others, including what they think about the afterlife, what they may or may not do in cemeteries, what are their traditions and magical practices that have to do with the dead, folklore that surrounds their homes, and so much more, available for only $5. $5 a month. Even if I make more than one episode in a month, it's still just $5 a month at patreon.com/weirdwebradio, or go to weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership. You can find me on Instagram at weirdwebradio. You can find me on Facebook as Weird Web Radio, or come join the new, fun, and exciting Weird Web Radio Facebook group. Thank you again for being here. Stay weird out there, my friends.